Welcome back, everybody. Another edition here of the Auburn Undercover Podcast on the 24/7 Sports Network. My name is Nathan King. We are going to today continue our series looking at each of Auburn's regular season opponents. Working backwards a little bit. So far, we had Penn State was our first one. Wanted to start with that in light of the scheduling news. I know everybody is excited about that return game in that home and home series. Now we're going to work backwards a little bit to Auburn's first two home games of the season before we move forward in SEC play. And we are bringing on today Mr. Jackson Moore, who covers San Jose State. Jackson, thanks so much for joining us today. This is a matchup that hasn't been played very much in recent years. It's been since 2014 that these teams last met. But at the same time, all of a sudden, there's a lot of coaching familiarity here. Brian Harsin coached in the Mountain West. He went against San Jose State pretty often. So I wanted to start off with you talking about last season for the Spartans. We'll just get right into things. It was a great 2020 for them. I mean, one of their best seasons in recent memory. Then things kind of fell off. Tell me about their 2021 season and what this team, what kind of year this team is coming off of, and why things went from a mountain, the Mountain West Championship down to I believe it was the 5-7 season they had last year.
Yeah, last season was especially confusing because so much of the team came back from the season before. So there wasn't expected to be too much of a drop off. That was kind of a rare deal San Jose State had in that COVID season in 2020 to win the conference championship, and the coaching staff, even that was already there, hadn't had much success up until that year. But most of the players were coming back. They did miss two receivers that tried to go on to the pros, and that was really felt. The offense just wasn't quite as explosive. And then a few weeks in, their starting quarterback, Nick Starkel, who spent quite a bit of time in the SEC, he went down with an injury, and suddenly this team offensively was not very potent like it had been the year before. And the defense, I don't know if it was kind of the chemistry deal with the offense struggling, but the defense wasn't quite what it had been the year before either, which was even though the offense put up some pretty good numbers in 2020, I felt like the defense was really the strength that led that team. So it kind of fell apart on the Spartans, and then the last four games, they kind of just they got stuck with a run of teams that were just really playing good football in the Mountain West. Utah State, who ended up winning the conference, Fresno State, who put up 10 wins, Nevada, who had an NFL quarterback. I mean, it was just a disastrous November for the Spartans, and they only needed one more win to be bowl eligible. So they're still, even though they lose Starkel, they went out and they got a new quarterback, Chevin Cordero. There's still a lot of pieces from that 2020 Mountain West Championship, and they still kind of feel like they have enough to put it together this year if they can get things to kind of bounce their way a little better than it did last year.
So that was one of a couple spring storylines I wanted to talk with you about. Is that quarterback situation? Tell me a little bit about him coming over from Hawaii. Not going to try to pronounce his name again. I'll leave that to you. You were telling me before we started, you also cover Hawaii as well. So that was a pretty good situation for you. You know a lot about him as a quarterback. Tell me about that position group right now, because like you said, Nick Starkel, Auburn fans knew all about him. That kind of gave them, a little bit of stability there at that position, and now they're turning things over in 2022. Tell me about how he looked in spring practice and whether he's 100% the guy for this season.
Yeah, so Chevin Cordero, he really, he was a hometown guy for UH in Hawaii, and earned the starting job pretty quick there with the Rainbow Warriors, and he was playing really good football for them. And they just had a very toxic locker room culture there with their head coach Todd Graham, who was released in January after so many players really kind of revolted, and all their stars basically hit the transfer portal to go somewhere else. And he was one of them. And San Jose State kind of lucked out. They've got some connections to the islands, and um, Coach Brent Brennan's actually the cousin of Colt Brennan, who had passed away recently, and so saw a lot of Brent Brennan in the Hawaiian Islands in the last couple of months, just with the services and things going on there. So for a lot of ways, it was a quick fit for both of those, for the program and for Cordero. And man, he's a very talented quarterback, and he was an immediate upgrade for San Jose State. But they do have Nick Nash, who filled in for Starkel last season when Starkel went down, and Nash was kind of a change of pace. So I wouldn't quite say a wildcat quarterback, but someone they would throw in there in place of Starkel from time to time throughout the last 2 years, even when Starkel was healthy. And I thought Nash also played a pretty good spring. He looked pretty good, but Cordero seemed to be at a different level to me. And Cordero wasn't officially named the starter, but it did look like he had a lead, and I would be very surprised if he's not starting in September.
I did not realize that about Brennan. So that's an interesting little nugget. That's probably something that's super well known, obviously out in that territory of the country. But I didn't realize that. Yeah, there was another. Speaking, you were talking about Nevada when we started. And you'll have to correct me if I'm completely wrong on this storyline. But something that intrigued me when I was doing a little bit of research about San Jose State is the situation with Eric Scott. So receivers coach from Nevada. Seems like he brought over a bunch of his guys. Is it 2 or 3 wide receivers that he brought over, and what does that do for the offense? Maybe under Cordero this season.
Yeah, he brought in 1 last year and 2 more this year, and that's going to be big for the Spartans because, as mentioned earlier, receiver was the one position where they were really lacking. They just didn't quite have the athletes to replace what they had lost from that 2020 championship season. One of them that they brought in from Nevada last year, Charles Ross, ended up being one of their best receiving targets last season. And now you look at who they brought in this year, Elijah Cooks. He's been, one of the star receivers for Nevada over the past few seasons. And unfortunately for him, he suffered some injuries, but I mean, he's just such a big target. When he's healthy, he was been one of the best in the Mountain West. And so kind of fingers crossed for the Spartans that he can just stay on the field, because if he can, I mean, it's just night and day what he can bring compared to what they've had. And then kind of an under the radar addition. I mean, Nevada was just a huge passing offense last season. Justin Lockhart didn't get a lot of those numbers, but he was really the star of spring. I believe even Athlon Sports caught on to that and put him in the preseason all conference lists for receivers, which I thought was a pretty good research on their end to have a transfer that hadn't really done a whole lot at his previous school crack that list. I mean, he was just spectacular. So he is going to be a very underrated pickup for the Spartans, and wouldn't surprise me at all if Cooks and Lockhart are both starting, both 2 former Nevada guys, as the Spartans' top 2 receivers. That's a very real possibility this year.
Now, in these first couple games, Auburn's got an FCS opponent in Mercer, and then they get San Jose State, sort of being looked at as tune-up games before Penn State. But of course, you can't mess around. They messed around with Georgia State last year and almost lost that game. And talking to some people around the program, they've said, yeah, we can probably only mess around 1 week against Mercer, and then you can't mess around against San Jose State. One thing that's been pointed out to me is the defensive front. I'm interested in your thoughts on that. That seems to be something where, look, Auburn's breaking in a new quarterback. We don't know who it's going to be. Seems like the offensive line is actually going to have to play pretty well there in week 2. That was something that happened for Auburn against Georgia State. Bo Nix didn't have a lot of time to throw. Their offense was kind of puttered out in that game, and that allowed Georgia State to create a close game there in Jordan-Hare Stadium. Is that the strength for San Jose State, that defensive front, and what else do they do well on defense?
Yeah, definitely. Just covering a lot of Mountain West football. Defensive line is a tough position to recruit in this conference, and especially if you're in a 3-4 defense like San Jose State, you've just got to have some monstrous defensive linemen that are tough to pull in. And the Spartans they've figured that out and more. It's mostly due to the super senior deal and the transfer portal and junior college recruiting. They've kind of overloaded even with the guys that they have there. But Cade Hall was the Mountain West Defensive Player of the Year at defensive end in 2020. Didn't have the season that he wasn't able to quite repeat that in 2021, but was still solid. I think if he can be a little more healthy, then maybe people realize that he can get back to what he was doing in 2020. And Junior Fajoko as well on the other end, another, not the biggest defensive end, but just really a terror at defensive end off the edge. He gets in the backfield a whole lot, a real physical tackler. And then they've got about 6, 7, 8 deep that they feel pretty comfortable with. They've added a lot of junior college talent. In fact, the 2020 season, that's really what kind of a lot of people felt like, aside from Nick Starkel at quarterback, that really brought the Spartans to another level. They had brought in multiple junior college nose tackles, and that made a huge difference. And last year, they suffered quite a few injuries in that group, and that's kind of where you saw some things fall off. So, the defensive front is well set. They're going to be able to deploy a second team that's not going to be too big of a drop-off. And they also have Kyle Harmon, an inside linebacker. He's the other star of that defense, and they're good, probably not great at the the rest of the back seven, but or back eight in this case. But they, they're also a defense that they don't quite have the outside linebackers that they've had in recent years. So you may see them mix things up. They might put 4 defensive linemen out there since they've got so many, and or go with some more nickel packages this year. So they're still toying with that, but they seem to have the pieces to where they're not going to be too deficient at any one spot.
So before we look ahead to the matchup, which again is super far in advance, and it's not like we're going to break it down position by position or anything like that, but just kind of want to get your thoughts on what you think San Jose State can do in this game. Just the program overall. We're now talking about heading into year 6 for Brent Brennan. He's only had that one bowl appearance with San Jose State, but their one good, not good season, but their one, spectacular season under him obviously was great. It checked off all the boxes. You did lose that bowl game, but other than that, making it to the championship game, winning, I believe they beat Boise State, right? They beat a Brian Harsin Boise State team to win the title in 2020 under Brent Brennan. And so just kind of what are the thoughts on the program overall, just from the fan base, people around the program, people who run the program, in terms of what Brent Brennan is doing? Is it going in the right direction? And kind of what are the projections, win totals, whatever you might want to call it, for what this team in 2022 is going to look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the fans are still excited, even though last year didn't, quite carry over what they had in 2020. I mean, as mentioned, what the Spartans were able to pull off in 2020 was just so special that, I mean, that's going to buy Brent Brennan a lot of goodwill. He is a guy that has a lot of San Jose State roots. His first 2 years as a head coach, where he was going from a wide receivers coach at Oregon State, not necessarily what you consider the top of the pecking order in terms of head coaching choices, but and then he gets to San Jose State. They have 2 really bad years, but the 2019 they started to show some promise. They showed the turnaround. They showed how he changed the culture of the program. And one of the big parts about that season that might help the Spartans around in 2022 is that they did go to Arkansas and win that game. And while it's not the biggest SEC victory, of course, in that season especially, but I think that it was a huge deal for San Jose State. It was their first SEC win. It was their first Power Five win in quite some time, and there's a lot of carryovers from that team still that got a taste of big time football that won't be as phased going into Auburn as they would have been perhaps without that kind of experience. So um, there's still a lot of momentum, I think, for the program, but they've got to be decent this year. Another losing season is going to start to wane pretty quickly, but I think this is at least a bowl team. There's a lot of Mountain West teams that just got destroyed by the transfer portal this year. So in my mind, this is a Spartan team that should be at the very least a bowl eligible team, maybe get to 7, 8 wins and be about at least the third team in their West division of the conference. They've got Fresno State and San Diego State ahead of them that were both ranked at times last year. They're going to be tough to top, but this is going to be one of the top half teams of this conference and should be a bowl team at the end of the year.
Yeah, I should have said, I know I said only one bowl appearance, but you're talking about the trajectory of the program. First two years for him at San Jose State, 3-22. The last 3 seasons, 17-15. So when you see that kind of turn, and like you said, if this team is expected to be a bowl team this season, be in the upper crust of the Mountain West, that's certainly a huge win for a program like San Jose State. I wanted a quick one real quick. Just I thought about this. What were your thoughts on Brian Harsin when he was a coach in the Mountain West, and what was the reaction from that region of college football when he decided to go to Auburn?
Yeah, another one of the teams. I cover a few teams out here. Fresno State is one of them, and the Bulldogs clashed with Brian Harsin 4 times in 13 months. It was a very unusual set of games, and I was at all 4 covering them. 3 of them were in Boise. 2 of them were conference championship games, and so I got to see a lot of press conferences and get to see Harsin a little bit more than I would have otherwise. And he definitely has a reputation in the Mountain West of being a pretty stern guy and keeping things kind of behind the scenes and just obviously being very successful. Boise State has just been rolling for almost decades now, and he had no drop off, which was very impressive. They were always one of the best teams in the conference, and especially during that run. Um, I mean, honestly, things got pretty heated between Fresno State and Boise State in those series, and there were some sound bites probably from both sides that were very memorable, and some that weren't too pleasant on either side. So it was very, a lot of highs and lows in those 13 months, but I'm not surprised at all that he got a big gig after what he did with the Broncos.
Yeah, and San Jose State is one of those games that, talking about him in year two, he's got to get it. You look at this first stretch for Auburn; they actually have 5 straight home games to open up the season. You look at the rest of their schedule after that; it really feels like they have to go at least 4-1. They got to take advantage of that because it's just a gauntlet from there on out. Last one, Jackson, then we'll let you go. Again, really appreciate you hopping on today. Just again, we're a couple months out. There's no use getting into the nitty gritty of it, but just number one, what are you looking at as we sit here on June 13th? What are you looking at as you look ahead to this Auburn matchup? And then also, you talked about it a bit with that Arkansas game, but what is the San Jose State program kind of? What is their approach to games like this? What have you seen over the years when they're heading to a team in the SEC where, of course, they're going to be an underdog? Is kind of picked as the bye game, but for a bye game opponent, San Jose State, like we just talked about, they've been kind of on the up and up over the past couple years. What do you think of the Tigers as you look at them from this far out, and then how do you think the Spartans will approach this game in terms of an attitude from Brent Brennan?
Yeah, this type of game has typically been considered just a paycheck for the Spartans for a long time, and that Arkansas win really kind of lit things up for San Jose State. They are a program that likes to do these one and dones and get their money and not try to get a lot of Power 5 schools to come to their stadium and bother with all that. But I think last year that momentum from the Arkansas win and the championship the year after, they just opened the season at USC or second week at USC, thought they might be able to compete there, and it wasn't too pleasant an experience for San Jose State. They lost pretty lopsidedly and kind of wrecked some of the momentum at that point, and things started to tumble for that season. So I think there's a mix of probably cautious optimism, knowing that this team is so experienced. They're so much older. They've been in these places before. They have more success than the San Jose State teams had in a long time, but also that there's some probably levels of talent that they're probably not going to match up well with. So I'm interested to see kind of where some of those matchups might be beneficial or hurt the Spartans when this game comes around. But yeah, I think it's one that at least San Jose State fans are going to be excited about and at least expect to be competitive in.
I'm excited about this one a little bit because 2014, I was a junior in high school, and that was the first Auburn game I ever went to. Actually, it was my first time ever going to campus when they played San Jose State. Nick Marshall, I don't remember how many yards he had in that game, but he pretty much did whatever he wanted. But it looks like San Jose State's in a better position right now as a program. And Auburn's, I mean, again, we've talked about it a little bit with the Georgia State game. They have these every few years. I mean, Jacksonville State, which beat Florida State last year, took them to overtime in 2015. Couple years after that, Auburn had 6 turnovers against Mercer, and I think only won that game by a score. All of those games coming at home. So if San Jose State has a good game plan on the defensive side, if they're able to rattle whomever wins the starting job at quarterback for Auburn, I think, again, like people I've talked to around the program, this is definitely, when you look at those first 2 games for Auburn, this is definitely the one where they're saying, yeah, we can't mess around with this one. Mercer, they can kind of work through some things, maybe play a couple quarterbacks. They want to make sure they have their quarterback by this game. And so show some respect, I think, from Auburn's side and the Auburn coaches for what San Jose State has been able to do in recent seasons. Anyway, thank you so much, Jackson, for jumping on today. I know our readers really, really appreciate all that insight on San Jose State. So all you guys have some stuff in the back of your minds now to think about once we get closer to that game. You guys can go follow him at Jackson Moore 24/7. Like you said, does a lot of coverage out in that area. Are there any? So you got Hawaii, you got San Jose State, Fresno State. Are there any other ones you're dipping your toes in?
Yeah, I'm also in the Pac-12 with Cal and Stanford, so I got all the area covered between the Spartans, Cardinal, and Golden Bears.
Gotcha. So if you're a Pac-12 person, or you like checking out things on the West Coast, or you wanna stay up to date with San Jose State, which you definitely should do as the season comes closer. Like I was talking about earlier, just researching them for not very long, you start to come up with all these interesting tidbits. So it's an interesting program. I'm really excited to see that game once it comes to Jordan-Hare Stadium. Jackson, thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you guys, everybody, for listening to the Auburn Undercover podcast. If you guys enjoyed it, please leave us a 5-star review. That's the number one thing that helps us out. The intro and outro music is by Beats by Mordecai. You guys can follow him on Twitter, SoundCloud, and Instagram. And until the next episode, everybody have a good start to the week. We'll talk to y'all later.